Well, thanks for coming together, guys. Thanks for talking. I'd love to just start with some introductions. I'm obviously David Smith, a priest at Church of the Resurrection in Flower Mound, Texas, and I have training in Bible and theology and have worked regular jobs in the past, but that's obviously not my vocation. Love to think about how theology, how our faith is applicable in everyday life, right? And just would love to talk about that. And also really respect you guys. Luke, I know really well. Dean, I know really well. Nathaniel, I hope to get to know you even better. And I'm excited to hear kind of the wisdom and insight you guys have from your experience. So just wanted to get us all together in one room and talk about it. So I'd love to start. Luke, let's start with you, brother. You and I got to meet and spend the most of our time together when we were interns together at a different church. But kind of let me know like your faith background in like 30 seconds, and then quickly transition into like your vocation, your work, and what is your work? What does that look like, and has it looked like for the past 10 years for you?
Definitely. So my faith background was primarily in the Bible church, kind of over in Lake Highlands. Dad, he was in seminary before I was in existence, and is still working at the seminary. And so I had just grown up around a lot of the guys from Dallas Seminary, and I think it was not only how smart they were, which is a bonus, but it was how godly they were and the way that they loved my dad and my family, and so that just had a big impact on how I understood what the faith was in general. And so I'd always kind of since a younger age, kind of junior high, had always kind of had a hook towards ministry, and toward whatever it came to what I want to do. I felt like whatever was going on in my life, ministry was always kind of the tendency that I had. And so anyway, so grew up that, and then it was in college, started attending the Village Church, and that's really when the Lord really started to work on me, into where there was a love for preaching the gospel and living that out and discipling students. And then went to seminary, and then from there have gone to Northwest Bible Church, which was phenomenal, and then have been at Northway, which is a Village Church plant, for the last 5-10 years. And so anyway, on the work front, it was starting with high school ministry. And I just remember I would have the kids on a Sunday morning or a Wednesday night, and they would act the typical way that students do. Sometimes engaged, sometimes not engaged, sometimes honest, sometimes not. And then on the side, had always kind of wanted to do woodworking. I grew up kind of working on the farm on all my summers up in Illinois, my grandpa, and then when it wasn't time for the harvest and working the land, it was building houses. And so I at least had those categories in my mind of a very godly man who spends his vocation farming and building, working with his hands, but still like really loved his family, really loved his community. And so I think that, even though at the time I was just a punk little kid growing up, but it forged something in me that was always kind of the paradigm of what a godly man was.
So you kind of had like you kind of had this presence of people in your life that you knew were in like spiritual positions in seminaries and churches and stuff that were godly, but then there was also this person in your life that was in a not spiritual way of life, vocation or whatever, but who clearly had a strong faith, and it affected the way they lived it out.
100%. I mean, he was like the elder, like the lead elder of the church, of the town, like of all of those things. And he did all the things a pastor would do. He would do house calls. He would randomly mow like an entire block's lawn just for fun and like play with the kids. And so anyway, so that was in the back of my mind. So fast forwarding, I'm in seminary, and I'm loving what I'm learning, but I needed like a thing, because at the end of the day, I would have read a lot, written a lot, talked to people a lot, listened to people a lot, and then that was it. And there was just, I think, a part of me that had a creative side, an artistic side, but even I think just I just want to work physically, like my body just needs to work.
Right.
And so my wife and I had designed a couple of things, nothing, I mean, it was insignificant and clearly a hobby. And then some friends of ours um, had a pushpin travel map at their house. And we had just had one of those conversations that was just life-giving and amazing. We were there at like 2 for coffee, and it was like 3 in the morning before we left. And it was because we were talking about all of these places that we had been and that they had been, and how God had worked through all of those trips. And so we left and we're like, we need to get one of these maps. And my wife was just like, there's no way I would ever put that thing in my house because it was so ugly. And so we're like, let's design one. So we designed one and built one. And some super crunchy friends of ours from Colorado were like, bro, you need to put that on Etsy. And this was before anybody knew what Etsy was. And so, so they're like, put it on Etsy. And we're like, you should shut up. That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. And so eventually we put it up on Etsy to shut them up. That was literally the reason. And they were like, okay, we're going to see what happens. We left for a weekend and then came back and had sold like 20 of them. And we're like, we don't know what to do. So we messaged everybody like, hey, we don't know what we're doing. We just did this to shut some friends up. We don't have boxes to ship it. We don't know. Like, I don't even think I have all the tools. I couldn't tell you anything. And all of them responded with, that's fine. We'll just wait. And we're like, think. We have
I'm going to cancel your order.
right. I told him, I was like, as soon as I find out how to refund your money, I will figure it out. And they all just wanted to wait. And so we're like, okay, she's working at a charter school. I'm a youth pastor. And this like little chunk of money came in. We're like, well, there's no deadline. Let's figure it out. And so we just kept making it and then never took the link down. And so it was more and more. And then we diversified the maps. And then eventually we launched wooden keepsake, laser engraved wooden keepsake boxes. And that grew into a whole thing. And right kind of at that time where it was becoming serious, we were still doing youth ministry and loving it. But I would get these students on the Sundays and Wednesdays, and they would be in my shop. And really, it was free labor for a little bit and just like a general discipling opportunity. And those kids would come in and they were totally different kids. And it wasn't like everything's fine, I'm so excited to be captain of the whatever team. But I mean, these kids would be in tears talking about whether it's struggles with, suicidal ideation, their parents' divorce, how they just wish their dad like saw them and loved them as much as their other sibling, or whatever it was. A general feeling of loneliness. Kids wanting to get drunk at 12 just so that they could see what it like, so they could just escape the pain that they're dealing with because their mom just died of cancer. Stuff that never would have come up on a Sunday morning or a Wednesday when everyone's like pretending everything's fine.
Right.
And it was in those moments a very different type of discipleship started to begin, and a different love for a new kind of discipleship really started. Because you'd have time together to work, so a thing to look at the end of the day and be proud of. But then there was just all of these organic moments for conversations that again never would have happened. And so anyway, my contract with the church I was working with ended. It got completed, and it was coincided with graduation. And then it was like, well, this
Is that
thing
what it's
has.
called, being fired?
I'm sorry.
Is that what it's called when you get fired?
My contract
If you
My
don't-
contract ended.
If you don't sign like an end date at the beginning, yes, it is. Or there's encouragement to search
Let's
elsewhere.
agree now that I'm going to get fired in 2 years. Okay.
Right. No, they're just your contract will end.
Hold on. I need another beer after that one.
Right. But it was like during these years, you'll do youth ministry, and then after that, there's no obligation, though if it goes well, we'd love you to continue. And so anyway, we the business had grown to where it was like not just full-time, but like we needed employees at this point. We had a studio manager. I had 2 apprentices working in the shop. One of them was from the church and one was from the seminary. And so that just kind of spiraled into this woodworking business, where it was like, it was a business fully, but it was like, Lord, how do I like leverage this for ministry? And so it was just,
let me interject. Let me interject and just say, like, just because I knew you when this was like, you were on the back end of it,
Yes.
it had already like become something,
Yeah.
and you left Northwest Bible,
Yeah.
because your contract ended. We'll call it that, and we're just playing with you. And so we were part time at a church, and you
Yeah.
were all in. I mean,
Yeah.
you were seminary graduated, a master's of theology, you had ministry experience, but then you were like, I remember you saying like, yeah, I was up till 4 a.m. I have an order for 50 boxes
Right.
you're just grinding out
For right. Yeah.
massive woodworking projects. So
Well, and
like,
then there was a couple of times I just abducted you and was like, bro, we need help. And you're
I
like,
got
I
to,
would love to see what this is like. And I
yeah, I got to go
freaking
do
put
some
you to
finishing.
work.
Yeah,
So
but so, and you ended up getting your own space and all the tools. So for you, like, it really came to a point where you were a full-time craftsman, woodworker,
yeah.
and had to figure out, and for you, like, um it wasn't just out of necessity, it was like out of a love for how it uh how you experienced it, right? I mean,
Oh,
it was what
100%.
you just described, and your experience with those students is for them, but then for you, I remember just the way you talked about it. Give me, like, maybe your 30-second, I guess, what made you fall in love with doing woodworking? Maybe you can't do that in 30 seconds, but
No. I
like
think it
what
was
made you
just
go like, I actually, this isn't just a hobby, like I can actually do this.
um I mean it would be after a week of 70 to 80 hours making a variety, like relatively the same type of product, but just a ton of them,
Right.
with small variations. Um, where my love for the craft only grew, my love for
Hmm.
the art as just in general grew. Um, and it was there may have been days that it was hard, but I never dreaded it.
Hmm.
And that seemed odd
Yeah.
when in comparison to be like, I've made thousands of these and I still am just like I'm just humbled by how beautiful some of this stuff was. And I think a lot of it also was meditative. And I think that there was
Hmm.
a question that constantly was in the back of my mind, and was kind of one of the regular prayers that I would have, whether it was good days or bad days, custom projects, classes, or just kind of the regular production, was like, I don't know how else to put it. When I read guys who are martyrs and they talk about how they were thankful that they were deemed worthy to die for their faith.
Hmm.
When I, as a woodworker, was making all of these things and the grind of bills and glue and logistics, it was like, Lord, you were a craftsman, and
Hmm.
so like it's an honor to have an opportunity to do something that in some small way allows me to understand maybe what your day to day would have been like, and whether that's you know Lord, you created everything, and that like this is good, it is
Hmm.
finished, that feeling, or if it's like whatever species of wood it was that he was hung on, like he had worked with that species of wood. So like for me, if someone throws me a piece of cedar, not a problem. Sucker's light, it's gonna float. You throw a big old piece of oak, it's like, bro, we got some work to do. Like he would have known exactly what it was, not just because he literally created and sustains everything, but there's the like his day-to-day job was working with a mixture, yes, of wood and stone and all sorts of stuff. Because as a woodworker, it's not just wood, it's steel, it's machines, there's a whole science and craft behind it all. But um it was a mixture of, it was an honor, it was humbling. In a weird way, I felt like it brought me closer to him. Um anyway, but yeah, there was all of that experience. There was this is a not just a love that I have, but it is a legitimate good, like
Hmm.
provided in the world.
Yeah.
Um,
There's like
but
productivity happening, not just
right,
like in your brain.
right. Like I want you to be comforted, yes, but like sometimes words don't work. And so being able to hand you something that
Hmm.
honors the whatever can
Yep.
be even more powerful. And so I'll share one story and then I'm done. I think what kind of hooked me in a way that I did not expect was we had these custom engraved keepsake boxes, and there was a couple orders on the bench, and I just put the boxes and then the lids to make sure I had all the orders correct. I didn't even think about it, but I stood back and I was counting them, but I saw that one was for a newborn, one was for a stillborn, one was for a confirmation, one was for a baptism, one was for a engagement, one was for a wedding, one was for a 5-year anniversary, which is wood, one was for a 50-year anniversary, one was for a retirement, and two were for a couple who both had passed away from old age. But it was like, I thought I was just making boxes, like glorified shoe boxes for these travels that people were going on. And it was like, these are all some of the most significant moments in anybody's life.
Mhm.
And so it was just it was at that moment where it was like this love for woodworking was a way to serve and elevate and kind of um, honor and help others cherish anything from the greatest day in their life to
Mhm.
losing a little one.
What you
And so
just
that
what you just described sounds to me like holy relics and kind of the sanctification of like you don't just store holy things in common containers. We have
Right.
we have set apart sanctified containers for holy things, and
Right.
that's a shadow of or it's an image of what in our everyday lives we do the same thing. Like, oh, I got to put this in a special place. Like we're saying this is special, and you're making something special,
Right.
and you're woodworking. Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah.
That's really good.
Well,
Great
that's
story.
awesome. Well, thanks
That's
for
awesome.
sharing that. Yeah, it's really cool to see how where you've come and just what kind of got you hooked into um, manual labor. I mean, craftsmanship, kind of all,
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then obviously we haven't even touched on the fact that you're now helping. You're doing some education and you're back into like a ministerial type role, but you're still doing you're teaching and you're doing woodworking and running all that. So I'm sure we'll get into that at some point.
Yeah.
But that's really cool.
Yeah.
So
That's great.
Nathaniel, would love to hear your story. You also are a tradesperson. You have uh, a long story of following the Lord and your own kind of journey. So tell us your own kind of spiritual biography in a few minutes, and how did you navigate? I know that you said you kind of started off thinking you were going to go into ministry. That was a big deal for you, like vocational ministry, and there was a switch. And for the last 10 years, you've been working in the trade. So tell us your story.
Yeah, well, I was born in Southern California. I was born on a Saturday, and then I wasn't in church the next day, but I was in church the following Sunday. So, like Jesus, I was presented in the church on the eighth
On the
day.
8th day. That's
Uh,
right. They
yeah,
named you.
which I, I just love
Was
that
there a woman there
detail.
to
It's
sing
so
the song
fun.
of prophecy over you?
There wasn't, so that's
Okay,
where the
that's a
comparison
missed
ends.
opportunity.
Yeah. Totally. I don't think that anybody even thought about that at the church
They
that I
opened a
grew up in.
scroll or something, right? Like in his presence, this has been fulfilled.
Right. And there was a sacrificial lamb at the church that there wasn't. That's a joke. But yeah, so my whole life, there's not a moment that I have not known Jesus. I was raised in the church and have, with a couple exceptions, a couple, prodigal like moments of wandering. My whole life, I've known the God that's revealed to us in Jesus, and I grew up in primarily non-denominational and Baptist churches. When we moved from Southern California to Texas, and at that time, I went to a big non-denominational church in the North Dallas area. I went to Chuck Swindoll's church in Frisco, which is called Stonebriar Community, and that's where I spent 7 years of my spiritual development. And then when I would go back to California for summer vacation, we would go to my grandparents' church, which was a Calvary Chapel. And so when I moved back to California, after high school graduation, I already sort of had like a built-in community that was there, not waiting for me exactly, but waiting for me. I was able to go back, immediately plug in. I had, you know, a church family that I belonged to, friends that I had spent years of summers getting to know, and through Calvary Chapel, I really felt, not that I didn't already love the Bible, but Calvary Chapel has a particular gift in teaching and reading Scripture, Genesis to Revelation, year after year after year after year, and which, as a now Anglican, feels very familiar. And I think that's maybe part of why I like the Anglican tradition so much, is because it's sort of like a filled out version of what I was introduced to with Calvary. But I went to Calvary Chapel School of Ministry, which was their pastoral training program. It was a 2-year school, and did that from 2009 to 2011, and thought for sure that I was gonna like do some interviews and become a pastor somewhere, and that didn't happen. I did go through. I had a couple of interviews, but nothing was really clicking with any of the pastors that I was interviewing with. And at the time, I was working at Disneyland, actually in Anaheim, and was not a tradesperson. I was not a handy individual by any stretch of the imagination. My dad is a tradesman. He has spent his entire professional career in the garage door and gate industry. And my grandpa, his dad, was a tradesman, telecommunications and power. My great grandpa was a welder. Two of my uncles are tradesmen. I mean, like, it's like blue collar work was in my blood. I just
Right.
wanted nothing to do with it. It just didn't
Right.
interest me.
Right.
I'd had no. I wasn't like, oh, my family did it, and I'm gonna, not do it because they did. It was just like my dad would try to get me in the garage and teach me how to, like, this is how you drive a nail. And I was like, can you do that in my head, please? Because this is terrible. And so I completely just like shunted the whole trades thing. And so back to work, to the timeline. So I'm not nailing these interviews for being a pastor, and but you're welcome, yes. And I was like, man, I don't know what I'm gonna do. So my wife and I were dating at the time. We were talking about getting married and having a family, and I was like, well, I make $10 an hour at Disneyland, and we're not going to get much of anywhere doing that. So I got into another job, long story short, that was only 18 months of my life, a terrible 18 months, but it was 18 months. And at the end of that, because it was so horrible, it got me wondering, is there something else that I can do that doesn't require a college education? Because I have my high school diploma, but that's it. And this like certificate of completing a pastoral training program that is not recognized by like any major denomination anywhere, and so it doesn't do me any good. So what am I going to do? And I had a carpentry apprenticeship lined up. A buddy of mine was a heavy machinery operator, and he was like, oh, I'll talk to my foreman, and I know we've been looking for some guys. I was like, awesome, I'll take it, anything. So I went to the union hall, got my paperwork, showed up, and knocked on the bungalow door, and the foreman was like, hey, are you Nathaniel? And I was like, yes, sir, I am. And he was like, awesome, thanks for coming here.
Can
I
you
don't
drive
need
a
you anymore.
nail?
Yeah.
That would
As
have
a matter,
been full
as a matter of
circle.
fact, I cannot. Didn't even get the opportunity to tell him my disdain for nail driving, because he told me that he didn't need me before I could really even tell him my name.
Thanks for
So
showing up. See you later.
exactly. So I got back into my truck and cried on my way back to the office and was like, I can't do this anymore. I can't do this terrible, terrible work for these terrible people. I was in property management, working customer service at like a high-end luxury complex, and it was miserable. And so I told our missions pastor at my church, who was a good friend of mine. I was like, dude, I can't. I'm done where I'm at. It's the pastoring thing doesn't look like it's in the cards for me right now. Why? I'm not sure what to do. And he's like, dude, why didn't you tell me you're trying to get into the trades? I was like, I didn't know I was supposed to. Like, what do you mean? And he goes, we got a guy that goes here that owns his own plumbing company, and he's always looking for help. And I was like, well, hook it up, bro. So I ended up getting his number, talking to him, and at the same time, in that same like couple week span, I had another interview with another pastor for a college pastor role. He was getting older and was going to retire and wanted to like bring somebody in to ultimately take over the church so he could retire. And I had the plumbing company owner and that pastor both call me within 20 minutes to offer me a job.
Wow.
Of each other. So not of the interviews, but like on the day that I got the one call, I got the other. They were like,
That's
boom, boom,
crazy.
boom. And so I was like kind of upset actually. I was like,
Yeah, of course.
God, like why
You were supposed to
couldn't you
shut
just-
one door.
right?
Yeah.
Like why do you have to make me discern things, Lord? Like what's that about? And gosh,
It's
dang it.
unfair.
Yeah, exactly. Flip the tables, punch my cat. Like no. So
As one does, yes.
yeah, right. Yeah. Is I abusive? I don't know. So I was like, okay, there's an obvious difference between these two roles, and one of the main differences is that if I were to go into a season of ministry and that season were to end, what am I going to do? Go back to a $10 or $12 an hour customer service job? And at this point now, I am married and I do have one child. And I was like, I can't go back. I can't make less money. So, and the church was only going to be able to pay me half time. So
Oh yeah.
I was like, even though this is everything that I have wanted and have prayed for, and I do discern a sense of God's call into pastoral ministry, but it's just the timing just isn't lining up. And so the plumbing gig seemed like the wiser decision of the two, which isn't to say that God wouldn't have been with me had I chosen the pastorate. It just didn't. I felt like I had to forego that in order to actually love my wife well and to love my children. And I'm so thankful that I made that choice because it's been just an absolute incredible blessing of a decade in this trade. And going into it sort of, and I we're going to get back around to this, but what sort of when I went into it, I was like, God, if I can't be a pastor now, then through this plumbing, help make me the kind of person that can one day be a pastor in your church. And here I am discovering that he has answered that prayer, and I'm very thankful for that.
That's awesome. Well, after 10 years of plumbing, how long have you been doing woodworking, Luke, now? Has it been since 16?
So it's been 12 years. 12 years now.
Oh, so before that. Way before
So
that.
we were already full time by the time the reason I joined the village was there was
Oh, right,
there was a
15,
passion
yeah,
for that
15.
kind of ministry. And so I just shoehorned it in, but we were already full time and rocking and rolling.
Yeah, so that's funny because I time just flies. So it was actually 2015, 16, and then 16, 17 were the two years that I was there. So we were together 15, 16 there. So yeah, you had been going for a couple of years at that point. So you both are like a decade or more in the trades now, working on it. So Nate, just real quick, like the premise of your, recently you were published in Christianity Today with an article on faith and work and how that works together for you. And can you give us like the premise of that article and what it is you were trying to get across and why you think that's been connected with so many people? By the way,
Yeah.
great article. I thought it was well written and people should go look at it.
Oh, well, thanks, man. I appreciate that. I was exploring one particular facet of the larger work and theology, a theology of work conversation, and that is in particular how manual labor and prayer coincide with one another.
Yeah.
And if they can, how.
Yeah.
And so the premise for me, what I try to articulate is that, first of all, Paul tells us to pray without ceasing, which
Right.
the scriptures wouldn't tell us something if God hadn't made it possible in some way. And if prayer is only me saying words to God, then there comes a time where I cease praying. And Paul says to pray without ceasing. So prayer has to be something more than me just saying words to God, which was my conception growing up of what prayer was. Is I say my prayers,
Right.
like that's it. And so is prayer something beyond just like a monologue in a Godward direction?
Yeah.
Because it's at least that, but it's
Right.
got to be more than that, right?
Right.
So so the basic premise is when I am doing my work for customers, God is, because Jesus said so, God is present in my customer, receiving the labor as unto himself.
Mm.
And so if God is present in my customers and I am in God's presence, rendering a service unto him, then what is that except prayer?
Right.
Therefore, my work, precisely because it is work, as long as I'm doing it with a disposition of heart in which I am recognizing God's presence in the face and the soul of the person in front of me, then that is actually prayer, which I think is not something that I've seen articulated exactly like that.
Right.
Not that other people haven't thought about that before, but it just was sort of like being able to track that through line from like physical
Right.
labor, the
Right.
presence of God in my customer.
Right.
I'm in God's presence, therefore I'm praying. That was like boom.
Well, there's a couple of concepts tied up in what you just said that I want to press in on a little bit, and one of them that might be a little strange to us, and to many of us, is the concept of prayer as service to God, as a work. So like explain, maybe give like a quick summary of what you mean by that.
So when we pray, there's one.
And by the way, anyone else jump in to help contribute thoughts to it at any point. I'm just trying to kick off that topic for sure.
Yeah. Well, so there's a Church of England priest named Father Andrew. He was a co-founder of a Franciscan society called the Society of the Divine Compassion back in the late 1800s. And he defines prayer very simply, and this isn't his definition, but it's sort of his version of it. Prayer is the soul's approach to God. Like very simply, it is a soul entering into God's presence in like a conscious way. And so if when I pray, I go into God's presence to offer him my sorrows, to offer him my wounds, to offer him my joys and my successes. There's this, if you break that down, there's this entering into God's presence and offering him something.
Right.
And so
and like there's like a priestly gesture where it's a service, a work unto God, similar to like what we see in the liturgy.
Yeah, and by virtue of our baptism, we are
Right.
all priests, right?
Yep.
Like
Yep.
we are part of the priesthood of believers, precisely by our baptism. And so to enter into God's presence in that sort of that priestly vocation that each believer has,
Right.
to offer our sacrifice, to render our service unto God. If I can offer him a service of words and a service of my heart, then I can also render unto him a service of my body as well.
Right.
And so I think that's what's underlying the idea there.
That connects to something you were talking about, Luke, where you were making it stuck out to you that like what you were doing had more significance when you realized what was going in these boxes, right? These keepsake boxes. It's not just like oh, we took our honeymoon to France. It's like, no, the
Mhm.
ashes of my stillborn child are going in this box.
Yeah.
And you're as a craftsman offering um, a really significant service to people, right?
Yeah.
And so like when you put on that hat, or when you flipped that perspective, like how did that change your way of going about the work?
I mean, I think it gave me, I mean, in some way, it helped me understand um, the dignity and value and beauty of just creation, and I think
Mhm.
helped me understand what is happening in the incarnation even more, into where it's not just an idea, it's not just a feeling, but that there is a work, and God, like when Jesus came, it wasn't as a man says the stuff and then leaves, but that there is this act of going through the ministry for our sake and taking the time to do it so that we may
Mhm.
understand. Um,
Mhm.
that was really beautiful, and it actually even helped me. One of my students, he was like, um, "Why isn't it that in the Lord of the Rings, why isn't it that they didn't just fly the eagles all the way there? Like, why didn't they just like then it's done?
One of
Like,
the major plot holes that would never get
Mhm.
answered.
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Well, and so and it was having to sit in the beauty of what God has done, and how time is an ingredient and he makes it
Yes.
temporal for our good,
Yes.
Mhm.
and
That's a
that he
big
doesn't
factor.
have to do it slowly, he can do it immediately.
Exactly.
And
Yeah.
I had recently read something, I don't even remember where it was, but it was talking about the beauty of friction in our lives, and to our convenience and efficiency is not the primary thing that we were made for. We were made to work and to glorify God.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so it's
Yeah.
almost in that friction, in the work of Frodo, like
Mhm.
doing the act of taking it to Mount Doom, that
Mhm.
that is a good in and of itself. And for
Well, and
Christ to come down,
that is a service. Like I think what you're talking about is friction. I would just say is it parallels to sacrifice.
oh,
The point the,
100%.
the point is that the
Mhm.
service unto God is a sacrifice unto God. I'm not doing X so that I can do this with God.
Mhm.
I'm
It
not,
is
yeah, and it's a sacrifice.
Yeah.
right. And so
We're
like
getting. Go ahead,
Go
Fisher.
ahead. Go
oh
ahead,
no, I was
Dean.
gonna say, and it changed the way to where it's like what I'm doing is not merely providing a product, but it is this act of work that is glorifying in Nathan, as you had mentioned before, and then
Sure.
even mentioned in your article of kind of and I think in the back of all of our minds with this is just this ora et labora, and toward
Yeah.
this pray and work. And I'm sure we'll
Yeah.
talk about it more later, but I think
Yeah.
I had always wanted to be a monk, and then in God's grace, similar to Nathan that you had mentioned, to where it's like the job that I thought that I always wanted, in fact, would have not been for my good, and the Lord provided a work for me that was for my good,
Right.
and was an honor.
Yeah, it's good. It's actually leading us to some of the questions that we had posed in talking about the whole biblical concept of work, and I think I'd like to camp on that a little bit.
For sure.
Kind of going back when we do some teaching about work and in the work that I do, we kind of go back and we're asking the question. It's kind of the basic question: is work a good thing or is it a bad thing?
Right.
Was it before the fall or after the fall that God said to go and to work the ground to cultivate it, and it was a good thing, right? It happened before the fall. That was that.
Yeah.
So it's this word, and it's getting actually to what Nathaniel was saying, and I think it is so beautiful. And I'm not the Hebrew scholar, so jump in and correct any heresies that might come forth. That would be great at this moment. But it's so beautiful. But the Hebrew word, is it abad? Is the
Avad. Yeah.
word avad is the word for work, but it is for to work, to serve, and is also interpreted as worship.
Right.
This idea of prayer. So when it's actually God's inviting us into this partnership with Him of cultivating or bringing forth goodness
Mhm.
as an act of worship in all that we are doing.
Yeah.
So that's why it resonates with us when we create objects of beauty, when we see a project completed to the end, where
Mhm.
it's these aha moments of saying, yeah, I've partnered with God, and it's an expression of worship.
Yeah.
And so I think it's really beautiful, and you guys
Yeah.
are saying all of that without actually
Right.
saying what I said. So it's awesome.
Well, that's so rich. I mean, and the priestly imagery that Nathaniel touched on in that article that you're bringing up here, Dean, in that creation story before the fall, God creates everything, and in the ancient Near Eastern cosmology, these different cultures think of like this garden temple, this maybe this the world tree. There's all these different parallel ancient Near Eastern mythical accounts, but in the Garden of Eden, you have this temple, in a garden temple that we see then replicated, or at least they try to restore through the tabernacle, through the worship of the church. But the garden temple is this resting place where God can be at peace and at home with his people. And the reason it's sort of a backwards etiology is the word, but like it's actually not because of the temple that the garden is described that way. It's because that's what God designed for the garden that the temple is then reconstructed that way. So like they're not trying to conceive of the beginning in terms of the temple that they know. God reveals the fact that in the beginning, it was so that he dwelled and rested with his people, and the people served him as priests in that garden temple. And there was fundamentally peace and dwelling. And sorry, I'm getting into like preacher mode, but like, yeah, what you're talking about is fundamentally a priestly word that serve and work, and that's why worship comes up. So yeah, it ties into like what you guys are talking about with offering yourself and your services to God. And we didn't even cut. Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, I think on on that unity of worship and work, the first time that the Holy Spirit indwells anybody is Oholiab and Bezalel, and to where they are making the ark. They're making furniture. They are making a place for God to be himself, like for him to be in himself, and for us to worship. And so like from the very get-go, you're seeing this beautiful connection of work is a good thing, and the thing is good, and ultimately it blends perfectly. Nathan, like you were saying, that it is a good and beautiful thing, and is in and of itself an act of worship.
There's so much there. The third piece of Nathaniel's, I'm gonna get that right. I keep calling you Nathan. It's like Nathan, Nathaniel. Nathaniel's piece that we haven't even touched on is the linchpin is that the presence of God in the other person. So your service is offered to a person in whom God is sustaining, through whom God is present, through whom God is working, and it's you're offering to that person that then is an offering to God. I think that kind of derails us to go in that direction. I think that's something that we should probably hold on to and talk about at another time. But that's to really tease that out and to talk about the different passages from Christ and everything. I think that's a really cool way to turn that argument, Nathaniel. And anyway, this was all really good as a launching from Nathaniel's point. Oh, go ahead, Luke.
I want to do one thing, because it is not this often that I get to enjoy the company of three well-read and well-trained Anglican theologians. I myself am a recovering Baptist.
Hey, you're an honorary Anglican, bro. You're basically. I mean, bring the kids over next Sunday. I can even dunk them if you want.
Bro, I worked at the Incarnation for like a year and a half, so like we're already like we've got.
I do remember that.
We've got anyway. All that to say, here's a connection that as a real Anglican, whatever, I would love to hear a little bit more on that. When you are a priest, you are doing a work that connects people and God, and obviously a unique way in the liturgy. But you mentioned it briefly previously of that there's like almost a priestly act. I don't know if I'm stretching that too much or if there's something there. So just for someone who's not a reverend, almost very,
almost reverend father in God.
I would love to hear a little bit more on what that connection is when it comes to how we understand when we are working
Mm.
as a Christian out of our baptism towards someone who is made in God's image. What is that act that the worker, the tradesman, the whoever is doing?
Yeah. So it's I think that's for Nathaniel, right? So just to kind of reinterpret the question, not only are you offering something to God through your service to that person in whom God dwells, but you then are in a priestly fashion connecting them to God in you, right? Like, elaborate on that a little bit, Nathaniel. Like, what's your perspective on that?
So this is something I haven't written about yet, but this is something else that I've done a lot of thinking on, and I think that, to try to not get too verbose here, I think that the way I would say it is this: the Eucharistic act, right? Like a priest is known as a priest primarily. They are seen, they are known most readily when they're in the context of the liturgy, right? Like priestly work. Like if I see you, Father David, in the sanctuary celebrating the Eucharist, I know, like, oh, that guy's a priest, right? Like, it's immediately identifiable. If we are a priesthood, a holy priesthood, then what is our that? What is it for us that we are offering to the world?
Yeah.
What is our Eucharist, right?
Mm.
And I think that my argument would be this: that our Eucharist is our work, and the act of our work itself. And
Yeah.
the way I get there is this.
Woo! Boy,
The-
better
the-
preach. Let's
Boy,
go.
here we go. It's the work itself, and here's why. The Eucharistic act, there's a fourfold movement in Jesus's words when he talks at the Last Supper, right? He takes the bread, blesses the bread, breaks it, and gives it, right?
Yeah.
Take, bless, break, give. Taking, so there's something there's a material that is given to him. He speaks a word of blessing over it, or alternatively thanks. The blessing, thanking, it's like both words are used there.
Mhm.
It's where we get Eucharist, right? Eucharisteo, the
Right.
giving of thanks. So he takes it, he blesses it, he breaks it,
Right.
and breaking is not fundamentally an act of destruction, it's an act of creation.
To share, yeah.
It's an act of creation. When Jesus broke the bread to feed the 5,000,
Right.
he broke it and it was multiplied in its breaking. It was
Just like his own body at the cross, by the way.
It was a creative act
Right.
that produced more, not that like destroyed and broke it down into smaller and smaller bits.
Right.
And so he breaks it and then he gives it to the people. And if you back up all the way to creation, God, I don't know if you can really even talk about it in this way exactly. Maybe this is heretical, but I'm going to go there. God takes takes the stuff and he speaks a word over it and he breaks it. And by breaking it, again, I don't mean destruction, I mean creation.
He separates
and
creates. Yeah. He orders it, right? He takes what has become disordered, the chaos, the void. It was tohu and vohu, right? The Hebrew there. Right. It's like it was just complete, utter mess. He takes the disorder and orders it, and then he gives it to Adam and Eve.
Right.
And so then Adam is told, now take this that I have made, take it and subdue the earth, have control over the created order, like do what I just did, but like 1,000 times more and everywhere. Not just here, but take the garden and make the garden everywhere that isn't currently the garden.
Yeah.
And so I think that our priestly role is our work, because we take a task that we have been given, we ask God's blessing over it, we then do the thing, we break it, which is to say we begin the process of creating, we fashion it, we order it, and then we give it to our customer, we give it to our spouse, we give it to our kids, we give it to our neighbor, and in their receiving of it, now we switch roles, right? Because if we give something, it has to be taken. So then they take that into themselves and they thank God for it, which is the word of blessing, and on and on and on and on the
Right,
pattern
right.
goes.
Yeah.
So
no, it's good. There's so much we could say about that. Dean, I do want to kick it to you, and I know you've got several prompts for us and things for us to be able to talk about in relation to faith and work.
Hey, we are already on the train. I mean, we're moving along. So
I know. I think there's so many different rabbit trails we could trace.
Absolutely, yeah.
I'll go back and listen, and I'll try to write down different little sub conversations that we can have for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Gosh, I don't even know where to go from here. I really love the way you outlined that, Nathaniel. See, I got it right the first time. I didn't struggle, man. I've been listening. I've been learning. So, but I love that fourfold thing. It's actually extrapolated in the whole Eucharistic service is fourfold. As we gather, we're in the Word, we're over the table, and then we're sent. And it's just really a beautiful way of looking at work. And I love that breaking, that creating that disorder to order, if you will, to distribute. I think that's just so beautiful. How do you get it's great for people talking theology on something like this, but how do you get this kind of energy and understanding? I guess we can go there. Just to the guy that sits next to us at my workplace, how do we get him to understand, or her to really see that the work that they're doing is a divine gift and a divine offering in that way? Most people don't see that. They see it as something we have to do, and that retirement's just around the corner. So I hope my 401k is great. And so as we talk about these high and lofty tenets of work, how do you bring it down to ground level with folks and help them really see the value and the dignity of the work that they're doing in this kind of picture that we offer?
I think, in my life, as I've done all kinds of different, service industry jobs and, greenskeeping at a golf course, and stuff through high school, college, whatever. I think really practically, I mean, it doesn't look like saying everything that we just said to that person while I'm while I'm on the mower, right? Or while I'm grilling at the restaurant. I actually think that it goes back to that word of blessing and thanksgiving, and it's a spirit of gratitude. For me, one really practical way that the Christians' work can differ from the non-Christians' work is the spirit of gratitude that marks their work. I think it's hard to understand unless you're in that world. And different sectors are worse than others, right? But I remember my wife, she was teaching in public school our first 2 years in Dallas. She was driving down to Red Oak, and just the lunchroom, break room of teachers, middle school teachers, is just everyone's complaining. The kids are terrible. Their husbands are terrible. Their drive was terrible. Everything sucks. And the spirit of work is, and I know you have some questions on this, Dean, but work is as a necessary evil for me to get to the good stuff. It's a burden I have to bear until I'm 65 and can draw a pension and Social Security. And the job that I have that actually provides me that future isn't enjoyable, isn't good enough. It's never enough. There's the lack of, I'm not saying everyone in the world lives this way. Clearly, I'm not trying to generalize that, but I do think in my roles, I've worked at Starbucks, I've worked in landscaping, I've worked in restaurant world and retail, and the spirit of of dissatisfaction and discontentment was consistent in all those jobs. And for a Christian to be in that space with an overabounding gratitude and contentment is really, really countercultural, and I think can have a really huge impact on the people next to us. And you know, the age old, like, you know, give them a reason to ask you why, you know, why you're so joyful, why you're so, I mean, that is like, there's some truth to that. And I think the answer is, I'm doing this for the Lord, man. And I'm so grateful for what he's given me to do. I'm not doing this primarily for the paycheck. You know, theologically, last thing I'll say, and let you guys answer the question as well, is work is not strictly for utility. Work is not that. This is where I think we have to get away from the idea that I only work because I have to. Like, if I had my bills paid, I would just do 100% leisure. And that is a subhuman way to live life, even in an unfallen world.
But it is a very American way to view it.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Like, if I could, I would just entertainment and leisure all the time. And like, actually, that would kill your soul. You know,
we lived on a Hilton Head Island for a few years and served the church there. And the tell you what, some of the most unhappy people we knew were the folks that had, you know, they can only golf so many rounds. I mean, they'd lived their whole life so that they could retire to Hilton Head Island, and they would come to church and they'd go, is there anything that we can do? We'll sweep, we'll clean toilet, we'll do anything. They're just desperate to actually find some sort of value back in their life, a value add by doing work. Because that's we're wired, right?
That's a really insightful way of putting it. Like the value and purpose of a human life entails the work and leisure balance. And it's not just for, I mean, it's really, really unfortunate that there, you know, we sit here in really privileged positions where like our work provides for us. There's places where it is a survival mentality, right? God's design would be that that's not the case. And God's design would be in a just society that you would work enough to provide for yourself, but it wouldn't be the only reason you work, right? And it shouldn't be that way. But yeah, like it's work is not something that we ought to think of in just utilitarian terms or just because we have to terms. Like, it's part of what we are as humans.
Well, and I feel like with kind of the monastic tradition and the way that they saw spirituality with Benedict, like doing manual labor was an essential part of human development, and not just in the spiritual, theological, past monastic sense, but like when it comes to just developing healthy children, if their whole world is just entertainment and sports
privilege,
and like it hampers their understanding of what is my place within this family. And so when they're little, as you give them chores, as you give them work, as you give them hard physical work to do, and then they see, oh, this is contributing to the good of the family. I have a place here. I have things that I'm good at. There's things that I can do. There's ways that I can help others. It gets the perspective from me, and primarily being consumeristic, but how can my actions be generative and helpful towards others, serving others?
Dude,
and
my 3-year-old is never more well behaved and happy and like joyful than when she's like helping sweep and work in the dirt in the garden and like has something meaningful to do with her body other than like play. I mean, we do like, even though we do like the like very minimal screen time stuff and like we're trying to be intentional about that, like there's only so much creating and playing and like unguided, like there's got to be some structured work. And like it's clear, like even in a child, how life-giving that actually is. For her it's play. For her it's actually play, you know. And like what goes wrong in us that goes away, that it becomes this like this burden, you know.
Well, and I think it's with kids, they don't separate, like they don't have like oh, this is I'm off and oh, I'm working.
Like they're just like I'm just always hanging out.
I just live here. Like what am I supposed to do?
Right.
Well, that's why we introduce 401ks really early in our children.
Got it. Okay, cool.
Yeah,
And a
so
Roth,
if yeah, all right. Do the Roth early.
Yeah,
just max it out. Yeah. But
Well, you
Nathaniel,
do
I
the
know that you
regular
mentioned
IRA and you convert it, so like you do the lower tax bracket. There's a loophole there. You got to teach
There
them.
it
There
is.
you go.
But Nathaniel, I want to
Really?
hear a little bit more because I know that you mentioned in the article with both Basil and Benedict, but just how there's this essential understanding and shift that goes from, instead of it being a consumeristic tendency, but to how do I help, how do I serve, and it was even in the example that we literally have in our bodies is you can't just breathe in, like
Ah,
you gotta breathe out, and you can't
Right.
just eat. You there's a
Yep.
rhythm to both the way that your body works, the way that the world works,
Mhm.
and so there's both times where you need to receive those things,
Yeah.
but then there's also times where you need to give those things. And I know, like I said, Nathaniel, you mentioned it quite a bit with both Basil and Benedict in your article. So I'd be interested to hear kind of what you've processed through.
Yeah, well, so I'll answer that, and then Dean, I want to get back to. I had a thought on your question as well. So Benedict, interestingly, the only thing in his rule, in all 72 chapters of it, the only thing that he mentions as explicitly as being monastic, the only thing that he describes as monastic, actually is manual labor. He
Yeah.
doesn't describe the offices as monastic. He doesn't
Explain what you
describe.
mean by offices for those who don't know.
Yeah, so the daily office in the Anglican tradition, it would be morning and evening prayer. The also called the canonical hours within the Benedictine world.
So like
There
the
were seven
scheduled times of prayer.
times of prayer throughout the day. Yeah, exactly. And so they had this like gentle alternation between, like, they would awake, they would say their first office together, then they would have breakfast and a time of reading, and then they would pray again together, and then they would go about and do their whatever tasks they were assigned within the monastery, and they would come back together and they would pray and then back. So that was the ora et labora thing, right? That's why it became sort of like the clarion call of Benedictine spirituality, and so he didn't call that monastic, interestingly, because when we think of like a monastic life and of monks, we think of like, oh man, they're praying for the life of the world, and thank God that they are. However,
However.
that was not what Benedict associated with monasticism. It was manual labor. And so I think that's a very telling thing. And he tied that specifically to Paul working with his hands.
Yep.
It was monastic because it was apostolic.
Yeah.
And so
And that's over and against the priestly office, where it was like your work was prayer and like in the church, and
Right.
you had no manual job. And
Right.
the monks are doing this manual labor for what? Like what was their contribution? Not only their personal development, but like what were some of the missional reasons for that?
Well, they would have, I mean, if you look historically at what monasticism and like Benedictine monasticism, I guess in particular in the realm of the British Isles and Western Europe, where it spread pretty heavily, they were centers for education. They were somewhere that people could go to get medical attention. They were not just secular education, but specifically religious education, which wasn't really separated categorically back then. So they were like,
but they taught people how to read and write in general.
yeah.
Yeah.
So the monastic life, they were huge. They were huge pillars of the communities that would either come to them or that built themselves around them or that they installed themselves into. But then also they were a huge missional presence then as well. And and without that, the manual labor was sort of a worker is worthy of his wages, right? Like if somebody, what Paul said, if he works, he eats. If he doesn't work, he's not even worthy of his food. So
that's even what they said in the Didache. They do the same thing. They're like, if a brother comes in and he starts preaching and he won't work, like, don't trust him. That's a false prophet. Like, get him out.
Totally. Yeah. I think that there's Dean, going back to your question about like how does the person on the ground who's not thinking about these things in the way that we're talking about them, how do they see their work as holy and as worthy? And I think the answer is that it's not understanding that you stumble into. I think the answer is catechesis. It's teaching. It's
Mhm.
they have to be
Mhm.
they have to be given the framework to see their work in this way. And so
Mhm.
that's one part of it. And I think the other part of it is having it um, acted out, I guess, in some sort of way, which it comes back to catechesis again. So I think my answer ultimately
Mhm.
would be teaching. But teaching what? I think
Mhm.
that on a Sunday morning, people have to see, like historically, coming back to the Eucharist, which in our tradition happens weekly, but in other traditions maybe it's like once a quarter or once a month or maybe even
Mhm.
once a year or whatever. But for us, weekly, we go forward and we receive this consecrated bread and wine. Historically, the bread and the wine was furnished by the community that the
Right.
parish existed inside of. So some
Yeah.
babushka would like bake bread fresh the night before and then like bring it forward. And
We did that at our parish for a long time, where we had a bread baking team, and I
The
loved it.
babushka team, actually, we called
Yeah,
it.
we called it the
Yeah.
babushka, yeah.
team. It went
Was
over
that
well
would that
with
be
all the
you,
young
Dave? Was that I
Yeah,
believe that was you during
that was
COVID.
the sourdough season.
That's right. Yeah. Hey, I got into sourdough before COVID. I do claim that I was on the front end of that curve.
Yeah, he was in the
That's
arrogant sourdough
I know
club.
exactly. I was like the what is it? The hipster sourdoughs were like, you've probably never heard of them.
Yeah.
My starter is older than your starter, kind of thing.
right.
Yeah.
What a weird brag for a
Oh yeah, for
babushka.
sure.
Yeah.
My starter
Yeah.
way older.
Yeah.
Way
way
more
older.
pungent, more sour.
Yeah.
It's a
But the
effervescent strawberry.
the
And
bringing
crushed
the bringing
stone.
forward of this bread that was baked in the hands of a parishioner, and this wine that was either bought by or maybe even fermented by somebody in the parish. It's maybe someone listening hasn't heard this, but like we don't bring grains of barley forward and like
Mhm.
and a cluster of grapes. We
Mhm.
bring
Yeah.
bread and we bring wine
Right.
because bread and wine is the product of human hands. It's taking the
Yeah.
gifts
Mhm.
of God and reordering it. So it
Mm.
goes back to the take, bless, break, give
Fashion,
thing,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
We've taken these things that God has given to us, thanked God for them, reordered them, and then we present them to the church. And so in that offering of the bread and the wine to the priest to be consecrated is not just the elements themselves, but the labor that went
Right.
into producing the
Mhm.
elements. And
Mhm.
so I think that if people can understand that that in a Sunday service, that when
Right.
they go forward and they receive that bread, it was first. It's I guess a little harder to see when everything's like already prepped and ready and
Right.
made.
Well,
But like
to help
there's
you to help with your point here, Nathaniel, I think for us it's the financial contributions. I mean, this is what is it? What
yes,
it is now is monetary, and it's unfortunate that it's like automatic withdrawal from it's electronic funds from an electronic bank account. So it has been disembodied in some way, and it kind of it disconnects us from what we're really doing. And what you're saying is, in an older context, my offerings in the liturgy we say we thank you, Lord, and we offer you these gifts, sanctify them by your. So we're these gifts include the bread and wine given by the people and the financial contributions, sanctify them. So the word, the body and blood is obviously the bread and wine, but like we're sanctifying also and setting apart those gifts that are given by the people that aren't necessarily bread and wine. And
right, because we
yeah,
in this day and age, how many of us are like like hoeing fields and raising up corn and then taking that
right.
and giving that to the church,
Yeah,
right?
like
Like we
this loaf of bread was a significant financial sacrifice for my family. Like that's not the case in American, suburban culture.
Right. Right.
yeah, the fruit of our labor for the vast majority of us is our paycheck.
Mhm.
That is the harvest that we reap after a week or 2 weeks or a month of work. And so we
Right.
offer that to people. So I think that at the level of catechesis, if people can be given a framework for understanding that when they put money in the plate as it comes past, that it's not just like, well, I guess the church needs my money. It's like, no,
Yeah.
this is an act of devotion where I'm offering the labor of the time and
The
effort
fruit.
and sweat that I put into this all of the anxieties and all of the difficulties of my work week. I now offer that to God in the form of this like chunk of cash or a check or whatever, and then offer that to God. It becomes the liturgy becomes an even more enriched experience.
Sure. Yeah.
For the average person.
Well,
Yeah.
okay. So you got a priestly offering happening in the whole room, not just by the one person.
Mhm.
Well,
Yeah.
and then you've got, I think one of the things I've learned when it comes to learning a craft in general is like sometimes there's the like, I enjoy doing this and that's why I do it. And sometimes
Yeah.
it's the opposite. It's I do it and it is in the doing that I grow to love it even more. And so I think when it
Mhm.
comes to sharing those gifts, giving those gifts, it's like sometimes it's, man, I love what the church is doing here. I want to give this. I'm really fired up about this new adoption fund that they're starting or these missionaries. Other times it's I really love my money and I've really worked really hard for it. That's not where I want my heart to find hope in and find security and
Mhm.
safety in. And so
Mhm.
as an act of devotion and worship and almost reorientation, the liturgy helps me go, this is in fact where my heart needs to be focused on. This is in fact where I need my heart to take joy and safety in is in Christ, not in me owning the money. Whereas I'm just a steward of this that the Lord gave me to do
Mhm.
well with.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's good.
Um,
Hey, I don't
Okay.
know if are we nearing the finish line here tonight?
I think,
Getting-
you know, so we're about an hour and a half in. I think what I would say is I've got a couple of different subtopics that I think would make really good future conversations that um part of it comes from being some questions that you've suggested. Is work temporary or eternal? This is just a temporary, just getting into that eschatology, talking about like what's coming, right? And there's not to open the can of worms, but
You're about to.
Irenaeus saying like in the kingdom when he establishes his reign on earth, like the speaking of wine, the grapevines are going to be so heavy with fruit. The grapes are going to be so big and fruitful, they're going to burst with juice and just it's going to be flowing. The fruitfulness of the world in really tangible ways. He's talking about. Anyway, we can talk about that. Like in the kingdom, does this cease? Or does this, what we just talked about, even though it's not there's no utility, is it still continuing? I think that's a fun conversation.
Yeah.
Well, and
I-
wasn't Irenaeus the author of The Leaf by Nagel? Was that him?
What? No.
Yes.
What's the joke? I'm missing the joke.
Oh
No, we'll get into it in the
Okay.
his work
Okay,
temporal.
punchline reserved for the next
yeah,
episode.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I think added to that, David, it'd be fun to pursue the conversation of where beauty intersects with
Mhm.
work,
Yeah.
and just as kind of an outcome, if you will, of work that we do, maybe a real tangible way of talking about our work with other people and the
Right.
pursuit of beautiful things, and even in a missional sense. James Chung that talked about the different ways generations receive the word of God or receive information about God. And the current generation, they receive the theology and the goodness of God first through beauty.
Right.
Whereas
Through the three transcendentals, is that what you're talking about? Where it's
not-
like truth first,
truth.
and then goodness and beauty, not
Yeah,
booty.
not that. That was a different generation.
that was the 90s.
Yeah.
That sounds like a Gen Z thing. That's
I
not.
think that is a Gen Z thing.
Yeah. But I'll pull up an article of a presentation he did on that. It was an InterVarsity thing on how millennials perceive and learn the truth about God, and
Yeah.
how former generations did, or whether we do it cognitively through catechesis or we do it first through beauty and the reception through our senses. But
Yeah.
what does that have to do with crafts that we
Yeah.
produce as far as beauty or the outcome of a project? What does that look like? And
Right.
does it have something to do with the eternal occupation that we might engage in our lives? So that'd be
Well,
fun to add that.
I think beauty and craftsmanship touches on, like, does it matter if we do good work or not versus bad work? Like, you can, is all work equal in this conversation? No, it's not,
Yeah.
right? And we
Yeah.
all know that
No,
because you pay for
no.
the product and you expect.
Yeah, because you can't sell any ugly stuff on Etsy. Well, actually, you can, but
You
not
could.
really.
Depends on your target
I
audience.
did for a while.
Yeah, look, that's true.
Don't confess that. Those people are out there.
That's
Just
right.
kidding.
Yeah.
So I've got,
Hinge
just
doesn't work.
some other topics, and this is a little bit just like of a teaser, I guess, if people are listening and care to listen to a future what's the word, gathering of these 4 people. But how do we? You guys are both doing like trades, but like, how do we talk about mental labor versus manual labor? There's people who are lawyers, people sitting at desks, design. Like, there's an element that in our day with technology that a lot of work is mental labor, and how is that different? I mean, it's worth pursuing, I think.
Talking different than merely like there's mental, but then there's disembodied.
Sure.
Yeah, but yes, I like that topic. That'll be good.
And then like the balance between work and leisure, and talking about Sabbath and what's the nature of Sabbath. How does Sabbath affect work? There's actually Christianity Today. Speaking of Christianity Today, book of the year was a book on apathy, by overcoming apathy.
Don't get it. We don't care.
Overcoming apathy by Uche Anizor, and in fact, our former boss JT endorsed it.
Oh,
JT
wow!
Yeah, pretty cool.
I didn't
on the
know
back.
he could read. That's good for him.
I didn't even know that either. I gave him a PhD, so he must be able to read and write. JT wrote a book on discipleship that has done really well, and he endorsed this book. Anyway, how does apathy and like how do I overcome that to care about my work when it's really hard to care about, right? That's a whole topic. Just some different conversations that we could have, I think, in the future, if you guys would be willing to get back together.
Nathaniel, what would be some ones you'd be interested in talking about? I know that there's been some things you've been mulling over.
Who did you ask?
Nathaniel.
Man, I've kind of camped out for a while, kind of in the where we've been talking today. I have given some thought to the eschatology side of things too. I won't tip my hand there. I'll save it for that conversation.
Let's go. Get spicy.
Yeah, come on now. I can't really think of anything else categorically off the top of my head.
Cool. Well, I think we can get back together here in a couple weeks and talk more. But thank you so much, guys, for meeting, for talking. It's awesome to just think about the things of God together and to think about work and what God's made us to do. I'm hopeful that and not only in our own lives, but in the lives of those that we're around, that we can help, like Nathaniel said, teach in this direction, and help people have a framework for how to think about work, how to think about prayer and the service to God, service to our neighbors, and I think it's really good stuff. So anyway, thank you so much for doing that, for gathering
Absolutely.
together. Any final thoughts or words?
Good work.
Good work.
Good to be together.
Good to be together. All right. Well, thanks, guys.